He is an inspirational leadership coach. He's an international speaker. He's a leadership blogger. He's an author. And he is the creator of this breakfast along with the CEO of Good Leadership Enterprises. Please join me in welcoming Paul Batts.
It's the choices we make and the people that we meet that send us in a new direction. And then we look back and go, wow, that was important. What pivot points are you thinking about in your journey that led you to where you are right now? Now, I'm so excited to introduce you to my friend, Joseph Otting. He speaks his mind. He's probably the most honest person I've ever met. He has physical endurance. He is the highest ranking person in the government that regulates banking. And I think you're really going to feel when we're all done with this that we're in good hands in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Joseph Hodding.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to see fall in the Midwest again. It's been a while since I've been able to experience that, so it's an honor to be here. As Paul referenced, I actually am a Midwesterner. I grew up about 300 miles south of here in a small town called Maquoketa, Iowa, which was about 6,500 people. And a lot of people I've met today in the room talk about the small towns that they came from. And I've always been honored to be from a town that small because if you ever got in trouble, your parents knew about it very quickly. And it kept you, kind of on the straight and narrow. But also, more importantly, is you got a exposure to being, with your family, within a community, the responsibilities that go with that. And I always was very fortunate that my family had a strong focus on education and moral and ethics. And I think no matter where I go, those are the traits that I think are very important in life. If you see in the bio there, it says, Paul says that I went from a car dealership to banking. And the interesting story about that is I went from a car dealership when I was like 9 years old because my dad owned cars. And as a young man, like most people in the Midwest, is on the weekends, I would go down and sweep floors and clean cars and do things, which really built a strong work ethic. And I was very fortunate for that, and I also got hustled by salespeople to buy them Cokes and all the other things that I think that you do in life as a young person that gives you great journeys along the way. After I left Maquoketa, Iowa, I went to the University of Northern Iowa, and I followed my mother, my sister, my brother. And while young people today have very difficult decisions about where they want to go to college, I didn't have a decision. I knew where I was going because of the linkage with my family. And so I spent 4 years at the University of Northern Iowa, and I graduated in 1981. And at that point, for a lot of you in the room here, you probably remember that was a very, very difficult time in the Midwest. In fact, the term the Rust Belt was very prevalent at that period of time. Nobody was hiring young people that were coming out of college. And unfortunately, a lot of us had a choice whether to go east or to go west, and I chose to go west. And when Paul talks about pivotal times in your life, that was my pivotal time, because without the economy being bad, which I of at that point in time, turned out to be a positive because it forced me to leave the Midwest and go to California. And I went to work for America, what at that time was one of the largest banks in the world, in Northern California, and it kind of started a journey for me to be a banker. And when I was a young kid growing up, probably fireman or construction worker was more on the top of the list than a banker. But I found an industry for me that really worked. And why did it work for me? Because I found an industry where you could use your intellectual capacity in the financial analysis of financial statements. I found an environment where teamwork was important, that we collectively as a group could achieve our team goals and objectives. I found an environment where competition, as I was growing up in the Midwest, I had a chance to participate in athletics, and so you competed against other banks and other financial institutions in the world. And then I also got the chance to feel what it was like to be a leader in a bank, leading a group of people into a direction. And so really over the next 35 years of my life, I was a banker. And I loved every minute of it. And I got to be involved in community activities. I saw people who had dreams come to us at the bank and talk to us about starting a business or saving money for a home. And at the end of the day, bankers get the opportunity to be involved in people's dreams. And that was one of the key components that I always particularly enjoyed as a banker is Richard Davis is famous for saying bankers are dream makers. And I really feel that that's exactly what bankers are, is they help people establish their dreams. So in 2010, during the period of time that Paul was describing, Secretary Mnuchin had raised capital and began to buy a number of the failed banks on the West Coast. So he bought IndyMac, which a lot of people are familiar with, First Fed, and La Jolla Bank and Trust. We put that into an entity. We bought part of Citibank. We brought that into our entity. And at that point in time, we had about a $35 billion what they would describe as a regional bank serving predominantly Southern California. And they needed somebody to come in and run the bank and transform that bank into a regional bank that served, consumers and small businesses and middle market companies and large corporate and commercial real estate, and bring that all together. And so over the next 2 or 3 years, we recruited about 600 people from the banking industry to come in and help us create a regional bank. The good side of private equity is they bring capital. The bad side of private equity is they generally want to harvest that in a 5 to 6 year period. And so at the end of the 5 years, we had a choice whether we would take the company public or we would sell the bank. And I often kid my investment banking friends that the minute you start talking about going public, we started having lots of people calling us about buying the bank. And ultimately, in August of 2015, we sold the bank to CIT Bank, and is currently part of the CIT organization today. And so I left that entity in December of 2015 after the transaction had closed, and we were able to make the transition into the new entity. And like in most instances, you don't need 2 CEOs and 2 CFOs and those things. And so I was happy in that situation to go find my next journey in life. And I did what every banker does. I moved to Las Vegas and I bought a golf course. Which most of my friends thought I had totally lost it, because the one thing that I did at U.S. Bank when I ran the commercial banking group and at One West Bank, I wouldn't let anybody finance a golf course, because over my career I used to tell people the 3 biggest losses that banks incurred during my career was number 1, golf courses, number 2, golf courses, and number 3, golf courses. And so when the rumors started spreading that I had moved to Las Vegas and bought a golf course, I think people thought he had totally lost it. But it actually turned out to be a wonderful thing, because every day I would get up and I would put on my shirts and my golf shorts and my golf shoes, and I would go to work for a couple hours, and then I would play golf. And it was an incredible life. And Paul and Melinda, had visited me, and I was really in a unique spot, where I thought, geez, this is what really I worked, incredibly hard for and saved my money. And it really felt, that I could be part of the community in Las Vegas. And then all of a sudden I get this call from Secretary, at that time, Stephen Mnuchin, saying, hey, I need somebody to help us build the transition plan for the Trump organization in the event that Donald Trump would win. And what most people don't realize is both the Clinton administration and the Trump administration, you had to build your transition plan so in the event that you won, you were in a position you could transition the government. And that is an incredible and an enormous task if you think about it, because most of the key people across government are political appointees, and that that goes at 2 or 3 levels deep, and then most of the people are career employees within that organization. So across thousands and thousands of jobs, we had to identify people to be able to fulfill that role. I would tell you kind of a funny thing about this is, so I'm spending time in Washington, D.C., living in hotels, working on this project, and I was responsible for the financial vertical, which was the Secretary Treasurer, head of the Fed, head of the FDIC, kind of all the key financial positions was my vertical. But the building we were in, we were on the 13th floor, and the people that were doing the Clinton plan were on the 8th floor. And so what would happen is you'd get on the elevator. I didn't know that person, but then when they pushed the 8th floor button, I knew, oh, there's somebody working on the Clinton plan. And so we worked really hard on that, as you can imagine. And I would say I was a quasi-executive recruiter for about 4 months, identifying people. We'd turn them over to the FBI. They would do background checks. We'd check on things they had said and published. And it had to be done the Thursday before the Tuesday election. And so thank God there was a deadline, because otherwise you could have worked on this for another year. But we had to have it in on midnight the Thursday before the election. And so at 11:58, our plan got submitted. And I went back to the hotel, and I'll tell you, I have never been more physically and mentally beat in my life. I mean, I just barely got to the hotel. I passed out. I had a flight back to the West Coast in the next morning, and the truth be told, I thought, well, we're never going to execute on that plan. So took me a couple days to kind of get my bearings back, and Tuesday's the election. We're with some, and the rest is kind of history that night. That Pennsylvania started, going President Trump's, way, and the Midwest, Wisconsin did. And at 12 o'clock at night, my phone rang on the West Coast, and I looked down, and who is it? It's Secretary Mnuchin, and his comment to me was, "Get a flight tomorrow morning back to Washington D.C. We got to put that plan in place." So it was quite interesting, and I will tell you. I took that job to help with the government under one condition. Does anybody know what that condition was? The condition was that I wouldn't have to take any of those jobs. So now you're probably saying, well, how does all that come together? Well, as we kind of put that list together, they didn't have a person for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency job. And I had been personally regulated by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency for many, many years, and always thought that they were by far the best regulatory agency as far as regulating banks. Had tremendous admiration for them. And so when they called and asked me if I would do that job, I always tell people it was easy to turn Stephen down, but it's pretty tough to turn the president down when they call you and ask you for a job. And when I was offered the job, I thought, and I said, look, I never had a chance to really, serve in the military. I've been in private practice my entire life. This was an opportunity to take everything I had done over the last 35 years and be able to go to Washington and do what I thought were the good things for the banking industry and for the regulators. And so I, spent time with my wife, and we talked about it, and I was hoping she was going to tell me, don't do it. But my wife said, you've got to go do this job. And so most of you in the audience are probably saying, well, what the heck is the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency? And how did all of that come about? And the people that were hoping I'm here to talk about Bitcoin are going to be disappointed. However, because as I travel across the United States, what generally happens is most people ask me the Bitcoin question. So if you want to ask me, I'll give you my theory on Bitcoin. But actually, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency does not have anything to do with Bitcoin. We were established in 1863 by President Lincoln. And just to put that time frame in context, he was elected president and began his office in 1861. 1863, he created the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency with the intent that he could create, standardized banking and commerce laws across the states. And at that point in time, if you remember, it was a very volatile time in the United States. There, states were, not necessarily aligned. There was a lot of infighting. So I can only imagine when he declared that he was going to create this job that was going to unify banking and commerce, a lot of people probably thought, has he lost his mind? You know what I mean? From the standpoint of bringing that all together. But other than, what he's most known for is eliminating slavery, I think the second most important thing was he created the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, because for all those years after that, it's been really the foundation of creating universal activities across state lines in America. And it's very unique. So what are we and what do we do? We're about 4,000 employees that stretch all the way across the United States. And our primary mission is that we have the safety and soundness of the U.S. banking system, that people have access to the U.S. banking system, and that they're treated fair. And how do we do that? We do that by having people going into financial institutions across America and looking at things like capital and liquidity and risk management and strategy, and making sure that when they roll out products and services to customers, that the customers are treated fairly, and what they sign up for is exactly what they get. And I am proud to tell you today that the banking industry is incredibly strong. We have the most capital we've ever had in the history of the U.S. banking system. We have the best liquidity that we've ever had. Our risk management is without a doubt the best it's ever been. And I would say the loan book, which is where banks generally make most of their money by doing lending, is not in the best that it's ever been, but it's definitely in the top 25%. And so we're in I think, a very solid time that the banking industry can continue to support, businesses and consumers across America with the activities that they are trying to do. And it is a very important thing to have a solid banking system. We have the best in the world, because if you think about it, not everybody has money to pay cash for a new home. And so what do you normally do? You go to a financial institution. Often when you want to buy a car, you don't have the money to buy the car with, so you go to a financial institution. When we saw in 2009 and 2010, when banks got into trouble and people couldn't access that capital, it had a pretty dire impact on our GDP, and it took us a number of years to kind of recover from that respective process. The other thing people like to ask me is, how do you like your job? Or are you having fun? Or are you enjoying yourself? And I usually look them right in the eye and say no. Because I would tell you, being around Washington is a very unique animal. I have spent, and Paul referenced it, I've always felt that like honesty and directness, teamwork are, principles and values that I always felt were incredibly important to your life. And in my entire career, when I ran organizations or divisions of companies, when you found people that weren't of that ilk, in other words, perhaps they were disruptive or they weren't team player, I just kind of tried to gradually move them out of, being involved in an organization that I was with. And now I know where they all went. They went to Washington, D.C. So it is, I still have hope, that we can have a legislative branch and an executive branch that can come together and fulfill what I think their job is to do things for the American people. But there are times on a day-to-day basis where I kind of scratch my head and wonder why people do the things they do. And this isn't a right or left conversation. It's on both sides of the aisle that the behavior, I think, is inappropriate. But I think it's things like this program where we talk about the good things in life and we talk about goodness, because in my mind, goodness doesn't come with age. It doesn't come with race. It doesn't come with sex. It doesn't come with geographic areas. It comes within our soul. And I think the better we can do goodness, I think it's the better for the mankind. And so I think the things that Paul and Melinda have done by putting events on like this, it allows us all to reach down, into our souls and make a decision that we want to be part of the goodness side and do the right things in America to make America great. We are an incredible country. As I've traveled more and more internationally in this particular role and see banking systems and social structures and things like that, every time I kind of get back to the United States, I want to kind of get down on the ground and kiss it, because it makes me realize how great this country is and how proud I am personally to be an American, but more importantly, to represent all of you in Washington, D.C. So I want to thank you very much for coming to this and spending some time with us. So thank you very much.
When you come in to lead an organization that you respected, what kind of change are you creating to make the OCC better?
Well, fortunately, some of my OCC colleagues are here today, so thank you for being here. In government, one of the challenges that I think we have is that everybody thinks they have to have 102% of the answers to make a decision. Well, I think most of you recognize in private practice, you probably get to about 93% of the information, and then you have to make a decision. And you're generally trying to limit that risk with that 7%. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I observed when I came to the OCC is we were of that culture that they thought they needed 100%. And so the first kind of couple weeks I was there, they said, okay, we're going to have a pre-meeting to talk about the pre-meeting to make a decision. And I was like, oh no. You guys come in, we're going to make a decision in the first meeting. I don't need those other two meetings. And I think at first, it shocked them that we were willing to take risk on decision making. But I would say it's like a flower that needed a little fertilizer and water. Once they've now been exposed to that, I think they really enjoy it, because they got to think more about it. They've got to think about the consequences of making a decision without all the information. But I think they also recognize the fruits of the ability to do that.
And so how will we, as people who are consumers of the banks, how will we see a difference in that?
Well, first of all, I think things will get done quicker. When new products are being proposed or New strategies are being developed. And really, the banking industry is going through some incredible transformations with fintech-related activities.
What's fintech?
Financial technology companies.
Got it.
So if you think about it, 3 years ago, most of you would not have had mobile banking from the standpoint. And now you think to yourself, how could I ever do without mobile banking? Get a check, The old days was, take the check into the bank, stand in the teller line for 20 minutes, waste part of your lunch, get back to your office. Now you just pull out that check, take a picture of it, and send it to the bank. I mean, those are some of the advances, and the advances are going to be, more transformational even in the future, where your ability, one of the stories I have is a couple of weeks ago I needed a new pair of running shoes. So like all of us, I go online and I was looking, to what I wanted. But I didn't buy the shoes at that point. And then for like the next 2 weeks, every time I opened up my, there were the shoes. And it worked. I bought the shoes. And I think that's what you're going to see in financial services is they're going to anticipate your needs. Like when, if you go on and you look at Zillow for housing, I can assure you that the next thing you're going to get in the future is an offer from your bank to finance your mortgage. If you go on and you look for a new automobile, that's some of the technology I think that's coming down the path. And I think we as regulators have to be on the forefront of encouraging financial institutions to participate in that and for us to get comfortable of allowing them to do that.
You're actually making banking sound fun. Yeah, that's really cool. So let's talk about 7Fs here. What does family look like for you these days?
It's always been a strong foundation for me. When you think about Midwestern families, my mom on her side, had 6 brothers and sisters, and my father had 8 brothers and sisters. And I often kidded my parents, the classic Midwest, you grew your own labor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether you were in farming or whether you were running your business, that you had family members that were brought into it. So there's a strong baseline in my family. In fact, one of the things that we do every year that I participate in, this year will be the 45th year, is what we call the Otting Open. And Paul knows about this. We have an annual golf tournament and a classic Midwestern kind of barbecue afterwards, where you either have to be an Otting or married to an Otting to be able to play in it. But it's the same date every year. It's the last Friday in June. And we come from all across the United States to attend that event. And the neat thing about it is you see aunts and uncles and people, every year, and some don't get to come back the next year because of health reasons or death. But that's a solid foundation. And then on my wife's side, my wife is Hispanic, and if you know anything about the Hispanic culture, they are a very close family. And in my wife's case, it's like Thanksgiving and Christmas, we're going to her in-laws. It's not even a negotiation. And I've learned a lot about, the cultures of the Hispanics family. And so for me, I have a very rich foundation on both sides of my life.
So you have homes on the West Coast and you live in the East Coast. How often do you actually how much time with your wife?
Well, I spend about 80 to 85% of my time in Washington, D.C. now, including an event like this where I flew out and then I'll fly back. Bonnie spends 60 to 65% of her time there. And however, she did inform me a couple of weeks ago that she was leaving Washington, D.C., and I wouldn't see her till January 7th. And then if I needed to see her, I need to come west. So I'll be traveling more to the west because she grew up in Los Angeles, and she is like the most anti-winter person I have ever met in my life. So.
Well, and you lived here for a while too, right. So there you go. Yeah. Okay. So I looked at your 7Fs wheel. You were like my ultimate fitness mentor, and it slipped all the way down to 8. What's up with that?
First of all, I do believe that physical fitness is an important part of anybody's life. And, someone once told me a long, long time ago, you only get one chassis in life. And so you better take care of that chassis, from a health-wise. And when I'm in Washington, D.C., or I'm at home, I get up every morning about 4:30 and I go to the gym, and it's just part of my life. When I travel a lot like this, it's, unfortunately, you're out late the night before at a dinner. You generally got to get up early. It's very difficult to fit that in. And so it's just a critique of the volume.
Yeah.
But I'm very dedicated to physical fitness.
So there's not much golf in Washington, D.C.
Not much golf in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So what are you doing for fun these days?
The interesting thing, one of the beauties of Washington, D.C. is all the museums and artifacts that are available to you. I personally, I kid people, Washington, D.C. was a little bit like Las Vegas for me, is that when you would go there, about the third day, you couldn't wait to get out of Washington, D.C., similar to when you go to Las Vegas.
Yep.
But what I've discovered is the richness of all the museums and things that you can do there, and virtually, 99% of them are free. But to be able to go look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and to go to the Ford Museum and the Natural Portrait Museum, Bonnie and I just circled the top 50 museums in Washington, D.C., and we're just methodically working our way through those. And it's been very culturally enriching for me to have that exposure.
I just thought of something we talked about last night that I'd love to ask you about again. So the White House. So if you go to Washington, D.C., you can see the White House. If you stand in line long enough, you can actually tour part of the White House. But you actually have been in the White House.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, it's that big White House that you're looking at. The first floor, if you get my number, I can always maybe help you get a tour of that so you don't have to stand in those long lines. But the first floor is really for entertaining in the White House. And the second floor is really where, the first family lives. But over to the right is called the West Wing, and that's where the president has his office. And on the left side is what they call the East Wing, which is where the First Lady's office is. So most of the activity that you're involved in is on the right-hand side with the West Wing. And I must admit, when a small town boy from Iowa, who can walk on those grounds and go through security and go into the building and sit through meetings, it's pretty amazing when you walk outside and realize, the exposure that you have. And that's an incredible, thing that shows that anybody in this country can rise up and do things if they're willing to do it. And I would say another kind of funny thing is I'm interacting with Secretary Mnuchin a lot, and 2 weeks ago I was over at Treasury, and Jay Powell, who's the head of the Fed, and Stephen we were in Stephen's office, and at that point in time, they were asking me about the economy, and I remember thinking, oh my God, this is incredible. Here's the two most powerful guys in the world, probably, and they want to know my opinion. You know what I mean? Which is just kind of the world, I think, that you get a chance to get exposed to.
That's really cool. So you brought up Richard Davis's famous phrase, bankers are dream makers. Yep. So what's your dream after the OCC?
Ooh, that's a good question. I gotta go work on that future one.
Yeah.
I personally had kind of spent a lot of time at the golf course, but also with the charities. My wife is really active in the Boys and Girls Clubs, had been on the board of that and raised a lot of money for the Boys and Girls Club. I also was involved in the Killebrew Thompson organization, which was originally Danny Thompson, which is a baseball player, and Harmon Killebrew. When Danny passed away with leukemia, Harmon started this foundation. We just had our 46th year. It's an event that's done in Sun Valley, Idaho, but half the money goes to the University of Minnesota and half of it goes to Idaho. And I think one of the greatest thrills I ever have is where we have people now that are 30 and 40 years old who come back to the event and talk about how the money that we raised helped save their lives, and they're productive people in America. And so when you go to Washington, you have to give all that up because you have to resign all your board position. And I will definitely go back and be back involved in those kind of activities.
Okay, so let's finish with just the basic goodness question. Where do you see goodness in Washington, D.C.?
And I told Paul that's probably the most difficult question. I really believe when you think about people that represent Minnesota, and they're your congressperson or your senator, when they leave here, in their heart and head and their soul, they're going to try to make a difference, try to make things better for the residents of Minnesota. But then unfortunately, they kind of get to Washington and they get kind of in the R or the D box, and their priorities aren't the priorities of the leadership, and they get kind of subordinated. And then often people get disappointed that things that are important to Minnesotans aren't getting resolved. But I think what I see is people that still share that passion that when they come back home, they want to make America better for people across the world. And I think that's where really the goodness is in Washington, D.C., that those people are on a mission to make this the greatest country in the world, and they have to fight through a lot of stuff in the city and see negativity, but be able to, charge forward.
I think a lot of us see goodness in D.C. through you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely.